Hi everybody. Welcome to the Unit 5 content presentation. So Unit 5 focuses on understanding what we're reading. And we're, I guess in a sense, leaving behind the topics of technology, although we're still going to be exploring how these same ways we understand what we read apply to digital text. We're focusing on the process of reading today. So informational text, the definition that we're working from, and I'm only going to go over these two definitions really quickly because I'm guessing that you have some information about this already if you've been working with the new standards. Informational text presents facts, definitions, details, and you see there a whole list of different kinds of informational text. Sometimes we'll hear informational text called procedural text or explanatory text. Formerly, at least in our Kansas standards, we use the word expository text. And so those all, well, technically not exactly, but we tend to lump them all together into this category of informational text and this sharing of facts. Another term that's coming up through the standards that I think is relatively newer is the term literary nonfiction as opposed to literary fiction. So I like informational because I think it gets right to the point. The other texts we're going to talk about today are opinion or argumentative type text, and presenting an opinion or an argument. The key here is that it's supported by reasons that are based on information, and information either comes from another text or some other source of information. So it's not strictly a person's opinion standing alone. So we get those two things out of the way. Now, let's delve into what we mean when we say understanding or comprehending. And traditionally, comprehension has centered around a series of strategies. Each of these strategies themselves are based on research. Much of the comprehension research occurred in the 1980s, and that research laid the foundation for what we typically call today comprehension strategies. You might have noticed, if you're familiar with the reading strategies, familiar with the reading standards in the Common Core standards, that specific mention of these certain strategies is not emphasized in the standards, but we still know that the strategies or the mental processes that we use when we're reading are critical in making sense of what is read. Today we're going to focus on close reading, and that is also a term that, although not new, has received much attention from the standards. And so my hope is that in this next little bit in this presentation that you'll come away with a strong definition of close reading, an understanding of how it's applied specifically to informational text, because when we talk about information literacy, typically that's the kind of text students are working with. So we're not going to touch on narrative and not even very much on opinion or argumentative. But as we move forward in this presentation, keep the idea of informational text at the front of your mind. So we read informational texts for lots of different purposes and different reasons. And sometimes reading an informational text once is not enough to get what we need. So I think of myself and my own reading. Let's say I've selected a new recipe that I want to cook for my family. I'm going to read through that recipe early on to determine what I need to purchase at the grocery store so that I can make that for my family. Then I'm going to read the recipe again when I'm ready to prepare it to determine what kind of equipment I need, what kinds of foods I need to get out of the refrigerator, what spices I need to get out of my cupboard. I'm going to return to that recipe actually several times to make sure that I have what I need. And if you're a cook like me who tends to read too quickly and then what you're making doesn't always turn out very well, I try to make myself read that recipe over and over to check and make sure I'm not leaving something out. I'm going to return to the recipe when I'm actually cooking, and that's at a point where I'm going to be reading that recipe several times again just to double check myself. So for something as simple as a recipe, I don't know, maybe some of you are better cooks than I am and you kind of have a sense and you don't have to rely on the recipe very much, but I have to rely on the recipe and I have to look at it many times to make sure I get it right. That's an example of close reading. Returning to my text several times for different purposes, all with the goal of gathering information for whatever it is I'm going to do with that text. So that's my kind of loose definition of close reading. One of my favorite researchers to study when it comes to close reading is Tim Shanahan. If you like his style, I'd encourage you to look for his blog online, Timothy Shanahan, Shanahan. I think that was the right number of ANs. I love reading his work on reading instruction. So when he talks about close reading, he describes meaning as being hidden within the text, and that the reader's task is to extract that meaning, and a reader does that by reading through a text carefully, a careful analysis, taking a closer look is what I think about for close reading. And sometimes that means going back and taking a closer look again and again, each time for a different purpose. So we're not just rereading just for the sake of rereading, but each time we're rereading, we're looking for some other reason. Just like my cooking example. I return to the recipe when I'm purchasing ingredients. I return again when I'm gathering things together. I return again to the recipe when I'm cooking, each time with a different purpose. And Shanahan really emphasizes that to get kids to do this, to take a closer look and try to determine that hidden meaning, our job as teachers is to give them high quality text that will drive them to look again. So close reading really doesn't apply if the text is simple. It's needed when the text is complex. And as we've noticed so far in our work on information literacy, kids are encountering complex text on the internet, but also in print. The teacher's role when it comes to close reading, first of all, is to read that text to yourself, rather than just giving it as a cold read to the students. And while you're reading that text and after you finish reading it, you're thinking about what is it about this text that's going to require special effort from my students. So that's what you're doing ahead of time to know what to teach to students. And then once you understand what is going to require that special effort, you can design purposeful rereading opportunities. So special effort from students might be needed if there's challenging vocabulary, if the concepts are unfamiliar, if there's gaps in the student's information, some kind of little roadblock that might keep students from peeling away the layers of the onion to get to that meaning. So the meaning is much like the treasure. And one of the things we have to be careful of as teachers is not to give students too much before they start reading. Because if we do, we take away their opportunity to think deeply about the text. We want to give them some guidance, but we don't want to give away where the treasure is located. And the treasure being that meaning of the text. We want them to have to work for finding that meaning at a level that is appropriate for students. So I'm not advocating giving students text that's way too difficult for them. Definitely not, and I don't think Shanahan would either. At the same time, we have a history in teaching of doing too much pre-teaching of a text. So by the time the kids get to the text, there's nothing left for them to figure out. And that takes away their opportunity to think deeply about what they're reading. So it's really about providing balance. Shanahan suggests that for texts that require deeper thinking or a closer look, we follow a series or a process where first we spend time talking with the students before they start reading the text. And here's where he really delves into the idea that we don't want to give away too much at this point. So we can set the context for the text, but keep it short. Pre-reading should not take longer than what it's going to take for students to actually read the text. That's a kind of a rough guide that Shanahan gives. And it should not cover concepts that students are going to learn or that are taught within that text. When we take away that opportunity for students to think deeply, then they don't get a chance to develop those skills that they need when they encounter complex texts on their own. Now, the first reading by students, Shanahan recommends focusing on what does the text say? And teachers guide students to consider what are the most important elements of the text. And we work on clarifying anything that's confusing for students. This is a good point after this first reading to ask students to summarize or retell what they've been reading, including key ideas and details. And that way a teacher can get a sense of how much the students are picking up what the text is actually saying. Returning for a second reading in Shanahan's process that he recommends entails thinking about how does the text work. So as a teacher, we lead students to discovering the author's craft. How is the author using phrases or words? How does the author lead into the text? How does the author create that conclusion that summarizes ideas? Shanahan suggests we encourage students to develop an awareness of the choices that the author and illustrator make. Why is this illustration placed here, do you think? What does this heading mean to the author? So really trying to analyze what the author and illustrator are trying to convey in this second reading. And then in a third reading, Shanahan is suggesting that we focus on what the text means to the reader. So we're considering how does the reader connect to this text and how could it impact the reader's everyday life? So really taking that text to a more of a personal level. Now, I would give a word of caution. I think there are some fallacies here that we need to try to avoid. And one is that close reading should be used on all texts. That's absolutely not true. Simple texts do not require close reading. Close reading really is a mental process. And if the mental process is only needed at a simple level, then we don't need to return to a text again. It really depends on the situation. It depends on what you're going to do with what you gain from that text. So when I'm reading the newspaper, which I do still read the print newspaper, it's one of my favorite things to do every day. When I'm reading a letter to the editor, I may just be reading to learn about that person's perspective. That doesn't necessarily require a close reading. But if I'm wanting to write a letter myself, I may read a letter to the editor very closely to make sure I'm addressing certain points in my own letter. So you can see two purposes here, two different needs for the level of closeness in the reading. It all depends on your purpose. What are you going to do with that information guides how closely you need to read it. Some people see Shanahan's model and think, oh, I need to have my students read all texts 3 times. That's close reading. No, absolutely not. Like I said before, some things don't require close reading. 1 time through might be enough. Sometimes 3 times through isn't enough. Recently, I was reading the book, The Philosophy of Software. Why? I'm not really sure. Someone recommended it to me. My son is in computer engineering, so I'm trying to kind of keep a little bit up on things so I can talk to him about what he's doing in his classes. But it was way over my head, and there were several passages I had to read 3, 4, 5 times to really figure out what it was talking about. So it all depends, like I said, on your purpose. Slow, careful reading can be critical or it can be unnecessary. Another example, right now I'm reading the book, The Fault in Our Stars. And that's a book, I don't want to read it more than once in many places because it's very emotional and I don't want to experience that again. So like I said, It all depends on purpose. And then the last fallacy I included is that rereading is a sign of not understanding. And we have this idea, our students have this idea, and I think adults share this idea on some level. If you don't get the meaning of something the first time through, you're not very smart. Rereading is a sign that you don't understand, and that is a bad thing. In some way, we have that image out there that it's a bad thing to reread. That's a problem. That keeps some people from getting meaning. They think that the fallacy is that if you are smart, you can read it once and voila, you know what it means. And the opposite of that, if you have to go back more than once, you might not be very smart. And that's just hogwash. It's absolutely not true. Our goal has to be to help readers understand that returning to a text is not a bad thing. It's actually a really smart thing to do. And I don't know how we turn around that fallacy, but that's a challenge that we face as teachers. If you want to know more about close reading, I strongly recommend Beers and Probst's book, Notice and Note Strategies for Close Reading. I've read it myself, very good, a very friendly, reader-friendly kind of book, and delves into this topic more deeply. Hopefully this little video has helped you gain some knowledge, and have a good day.